the woman who lost her voice, and the cowboy who gave her a reason to speak again. Eleanor Price hadn't spoken in 8 months, not since the night her fiancé's betrayal left her voice shattered alongside her heart. Now she stood at the edge of Colorado territory, a mail-order bride promised to a widower she'd never met, a man who needed a mother for his daughter, not a woman haunted by silence. But when the wrong cowboy came to fetch her, everything changed. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The woman who forgot how to speak. The stagecoach wheels groaned to a halt, sending a spray of frozen mud across the boardwalk of Millstone, Colorado. Eleanor Price gripped the edge of her seat, her gloved fingers white-knuckled against the worn wood, and stared through the dusty window at a town that looked like it had been carved from ice and loneliness. It was late November 1883, and winter had already dug its claws deep into the Rocky Mountains. The driver, a grizzled man who'd spoken maybe 10 words during the entire 2-day journey from Denver, climbed down with a grunt and yanked open the passenger door. "Millstone," he announced, as if the desolate collection of weathered buildings needed introduction. Last stop. Eleanor gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in this world. Her fingers trembled, though whether from cold or terror, she couldn't say. Probably both. She stepped down onto the street, her boots sinking slightly into the half-frozen mud, and pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind cut through the thin wool like a knife, sharp and merciless, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and cattle and something else, something wild and untamed that spoke of mountains and endless sky. Millstone wasn't much to look at. A general store with paint peeling from its sign, a saloon with bat-wing doors that swung slightly in the wind, a church with a crooked steeple, a livery stable, maybe 20 buildings in all, scattered along a single muddy street like forgotten thoughts, and not a soul in sight. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter, the one she'd read so many times the creases had worn soft as silk. The paper trembled in her hands. "Mrs. Eleanor Price, I am a widower with a young daughter in need of a mother's care. I own a cattle ranch 5 miles outside Millstone. I am a God-fearing man of steady temperament. I do not drink or gamble. I seek a companion of good character to help raise my child and manage my household. If you are willing, I will meet your stage on November 24th. Respectfully, Daniel Hale. November 24th. Today." Eleanor scanned the empty street again, searching for a man she'd recognize only from the tintype photograph he'd sent, a stern-faced rancher with dark hair and eyes that revealed nothing. But there was no one, just the wind and the cold and the awful silence. The silence. It pressed against her like a physical thing, familiar and suffocating. She'd lived inside silence for 8 months now, ever since that night in Chicago when she'd discovered Thomas, her fiancé, the man she'd trusted with every fragile piece of her heart, in the arms of her own sister. She'd opened her mouth to scream, to rage, to demand answers, and nothing had come out. Nothing. As if her voice had simply stopped. As if the betrayal had reached down her throat and strangled every word she'd ever known. The doctors called it hysterical aphonia, a trauma response. They said her voice would return when she was ready, when she felt safe again. But Eleanor didn't believe she'd ever feel safe again. "Ma'am? You Mrs. Price?" The voice came from behind her, low and gentle, with the rough edges of someone who spent more time talking to horses than people. Eleanor spun around, her breath catching. A man stood at the corner of the general store, leading 2 horses, a sorrel mare and a rangy buckskin gelding. He was tall, with broad shoulders beneath a worn duster coat, and he moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He couldn't have been more than 30, with sun-bronzed skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat. But it was his eyes that caught her, soft gray blue, like the sky just before a storm, and filled with a kindness that made her chest ache. He stepped closer, and she noticed the way he moved carefully, slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "I'm Jacob Ward," he said. "I work for Daniel Hale. He asked me to fetch you. He's out at the far pasture dealing with some sick cattle. Should be back by nightfall." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Nothing. The familiar panic rose in her throat, the terrible, helpless feeling of having something to say and no way to say it. She clutched her carpet bag tighter and managed a single jerky nod. If Jacob noticed her silence, he gave no sign. He simply touched the brim of his hat and smiled, a real smile, warm and unhurried. "Well then, welcome to Millstone, Mrs. Price. I hope the journey wasn't too rough on you." She stared at him, this stranger with kind eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not her voice, that remained locked away, but something else. Something that had been frozen solid for 8 months. "Let me help with your trunk," Jacob said, already moving toward where the driver had dropped it on the boardwalk. He lifted it like it weighed nothing and secured it to the pack saddle on the buckskin. "Ranch is about an hour's ride. We should head out soon if we want to make it before dark. Temperature drops fast once the sun goes down." Eleanor nodded again. It was all she could do. Jacob helped her onto the sorrel mare, his touch gentle but sure, steadying her as she found the stirrups. Then he swung onto the buckskin with the fluid ease of a man who'd been born in a saddle, and they started down the street at an easy walk. The town fell away behind them, and suddenly there was nothing but mountains and sky and the vast, rolling emptiness of the high plains. Eleanor had never seen anything like it. Chicago had been all sharp angles and crowded streets, buildings pressed together like teeth, the air thick with smoke and noise and the constant press of humanity. But this was different. The land stretched out in every direction, endless and unforgiving, beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "First time out west?" Jacob asked after a while, his voice cutting gently through the silence. Eleanor nodded. "It's something, isn't it?" He gestured toward the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already white with snow. "Takes some getting used to, all this space, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." He paused, then added, "Daniel's ranch is a good place. He's a decent man, fair, works hard. And little Abigail, his daughter, she's sweet as they come. 7 years old, smart as a whip, talks enough for 3 people." He smiled again, that same warm, easy smile. "I think you'll like her." Eleanor wondered if he noticed that she hadn't spoken, if he was bothered by it. If Daniel Hale would be bothered by it when he discovered he'd brought a mute woman to care for his daughter. But Jacob just kept talking, his voice a steady, soothing rumble that somehow made the vast emptiness feel less terrifying. He pointed out landmarks as they rode. The creek that marked the boundary of Hale land, the ridge where elk sometimes grazed in the mornings, the copse of aspens that turned gold in September. He talked about the cattle, the upcoming winter, the way snow could pile 6 feet high in a single night. And Eleanor listened. It had been so long since anyone had simply talked to her, without demanding answers, without looking at her with pity or frustration, or that terrible, awkward confusion that came when people realized she wouldn't speak. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when the ranch finally came into view. It wasn't grand, just a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a barn, a few outbuildings, and corrals stretching out on either side. But it looked solid, permanent, like it had been there forever and would remain long after they were all dust. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as they rode into the yard, the front door burst open and a small figure came flying out. "She's here! She's here!" The girl, Abigail, it had to be, raced across the porch and down the steps, her dark braids bouncing, her face lit with pure, uncomplicated joy. She skidded to a stop beside Eleanor's horse, bouncing on her toes. "Are you Miss Eleanor? Are you my new mama?" The words hit Eleanor like a fist to the chest. She froze, still mounted, staring down at this child with her father's dark hair and her mother's delicate features. This little girl who'd lost so much and now looked up at Eleanor with such desperate, naked hope. "Are you my new mama?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to answer, wanted to reassure this child, wanted to be worthy of that hope. But the words stayed locked away, trapped behind walls of fear and pain she couldn't scale. Jacob dismounted smoothly and came to help Eleanor down. His hands were steady on her waist, and when her feet touched the ground, he didn't let go immediately, just held on long enough for her to find her balance. "Give Mrs. Price a moment to catch her breath, Abby," he said gently. "She's had a long journey." Abigail's smile dimmed slightly, but she bobbed her head. "Of course. I'm sorry. I'm just so happy you're here. Papa said you were coming, and I've been waiting and waiting, and... She stopped, took a breath, then launched forward and wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist in a fierce hug. Eleanor stood rigid for a moment, overwhelmed, then slowly, tentatively, brought her hands up to rest on the child's shoulders. Abigail's hair smelled like soap and wood smoke. Her arms were surprisingly strong, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen and hard for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Come on," Abigail said, pulling back and grabbing Eleanor's hand. "Let me show you the house. I cleaned my room special, and Mrs. Garrett from town helped me make bread this morning. Papa said I had to learn because you'd be tired when you got here. And Abby." A new voice, deeper and rougher. Eleanor looked up to find a man standing in the doorway of the house. Daniel Hale, she presumed. He was taller than Jacob, leaner, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his whole life working outside. His face was exactly like the tintype, stern and closed, revealing nothing. "Let Mrs. Price get settled before you talk her ear off." "Yes, Papa." Abigail's voice dropped to a whisper, but she kept hold of Eleanor's hand, tugging her toward the house. Daniel stepped aside as they approached, his eyes moving over Eleanor with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock. "Mrs. Price, welcome. I apologize for not meeting your stage myself. We had some cattle come down sick, probably ate bad forage. Jacob mentioned he filled you in." Eleanor nodded. She tried to smile, but her face felt stiff, frozen. "Jacob can bring your things inside," Daniel continued. "Abigail will show you to your room. We eat supper at 6. I expect you'll want to rest." It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was simply practical. A transaction being completed. Eleanor felt herself shrinking inside her clothes, becoming smaller, less significant. Just another piece of the ranch's machinery brought in to perform a function. But then Abigail squeezed her hand and pulled her inside, chattering about curtains and quilts and the view from the window, and Eleanor let herself be drawn forward into this new life she'd chosen, or perhaps fled into. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. The house was exactly as she'd expected, clean and well-maintained but cold. Not in temperature, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the main room with warmth, but in feeling. Every surface was neat, every item in its place, but there was no warmth, no life, no sense that this was a home where people laughed or sang or loved. It was a house of routines and responsibilities, nothing more. Abigail led her upstairs to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. "This was supposed to be the nursery," the girl said, her voice dropping slightly. "For when Mama and Papa had more babies. But then Mama got sick and..." She trailed off, then brightened with determined cheer. "But now you're here, so maybe you and Papa will have babies and I'll get brothers and sisters." Eleanor's stomach clenched. She hadn't thought about that aspect of this arrangement, hadn't let herself think about it. The letter had mentioned companionship and household management. Nothing about intimacy, about being a wife in that way. The room was small but comfortable. A narrow bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, a rocking chair by the window. Simple, serviceable. A place to sleep and dress and nothing more. "Do you like it?" Abigail asked anxiously. "We can move things around if you want. And there's space in the wardrobe, and Mrs. Garrett said we should put fresh flowers on the table, but Papa said that was silly in November, but I picked some dried grass that looks kind of pretty, and..." Eleanor turned and, very gently, placed her finger over Abigail's lips. The girl's eyes went wide. Then Eleanor smiled, a real smile, small but genuine, and nodded. The room was fine, more than fine. Abigail's face broke into a grin. "Good. I'll let you rest. Papa says supper is at 6, but I can come get you before if you want, and..." She stopped, reading something in Eleanor's expression. "Okay, I'll come get you at 6. Exactly 6. She bounded out, her footsteps thundering down the stairs, and Eleanor was alone. She sank onto the bed and pressed her hands over her face. The silence pressed in, not the comfortable silence of solitude, but the heavy, suffocating silence of words unspoken, questions unanswered, a voice locked away where it couldn't hurt anyone or be hurt. Through the window, she could see Jacob leading the horses toward the barn, his movements easy and unhurried. He paused to stroke the buckskin's neck, murmuring something she couldn't hear, and the horse lowered its head and nuzzled his shoulder. There was such gentleness in the gesture, such unspoken communication, that Eleanor felt her throat tighten again. She turned away and began unpacking her trunk. Supper was a quiet affair. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Abigail on his right, Eleanor on his left. Jacob ate with them. Apparently he took his meals with the family, though he lived in a small cabin near the barn. A fourth place was set, but empty. "That's for Mama," Abigail whispered, noticing Eleanor's glance. "Papa sets a place for her every night. Says it helps him remember she's still watching over us." Eleanor's heart squeezed. She looked at Daniel, but his face revealed nothing as he bowed his head to say grace. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for bringing Mrs. Price safely to us. Bless this house and all who dwell in it. Amen." "Amen," Abigail echoed. Eleanor mouthed the word, silent. The meal itself was simple: venison stew, bread, canned vegetables from last summer's garden. Abigail chattered throughout, asking Eleanor questions that required only nods or shakes of her head. Did she like horses? Did she know how to sew? Had she ever seen a bear? Eleanor answered as best she could with gestures, and Abigail seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. But she could feel Daniel's eyes on her, assessing, questioning. Once, halfway through the meal, he spoke directly to her for the first time. "I assume you can read and write, Mrs. Price." Eleanor nodded. "Good. Abigail needs tutoring in her letters. Her mother was teaching her before—" He paused, the only crack in his controlled facade. "Before she passed. I'd like you to continue that." Another nod. "Can you cook?" Nod. "Clean, mend clothes, manage a household?" Nod, 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 like a puppet on strings. "Why haven't you spoken since you arrived?" The question came sharp and sudden, cutting through the careful politeness like a blade. Eleanor froze. Her hands clenched in her lap. She could feel 3 pairs of eyes on her. Daniel's stern and demanding, Abigail's worried, Jacob's, something else, something softer. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried to force sound through her throat, but it was like pushing against stone. Nothing came. "Papa," Abigail said quietly. "Maybe she's just tired." "A woman should be able to speak," Daniel said, his voice flat, "especially if she's to teach my daughter and manage my house." "Daniel?" Jacob's voice was low, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. "She's been traveling for 2 days. She's in a strange place with strange people. Give her time." Daniel's jaw tightened. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might argue, might demand answers she couldn't give. But then he simply stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine. Time. But I'll expect you to pull your weight, Mrs. Price. Voice or no voice. This isn't a charity house." He walked out, leaving his half-finished meal on the table. The room fell silent. Abigail stared down at her plate, her earlier joy completely extinguished. And Eleanor felt shame wash over her, hot and thick and familiar. She'd been here less than 3 hours, and already she was a disappointment, a burden, a problem to be solved. "Don't mind him," Jacob said quietly. "His wife's death hit him hard. He's not good with feelings, or change, or much of anything that isn't cattle and land." He offered her a small smile. "But he's not cruel, just closed off." Eleanor looked at him, this kind cowboy with storm-colored eyes, and felt something in her chest unclench slightly. She managed a tiny nod. "Tell you what," Jacob continued, pushing back from the table. "How about tomorrow morning, if you're up for it? I take you on a ride around the property. Show you the lay of the land. Abby can come too if she wants. Make it feel less like being trapped in a strange house." "Can I?" Abigail's head shot up, hope flooding back into her face. "Can I really come?" "If Mrs. Price doesn't mind." Eleanor reached over and squeezed Abigail's hand. "Yes, of course." The girl's smile could have lit the whole territory. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Abigail's soft, even breathing. Farther away, the creak of Daniel's footsteps as he moved around his room. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Eleanor pulled the quilt up to her chin and tried to remember why she'd come here. What she'd been hoping for. Escape, yes. Safety, maybe. A place where her silence wouldn't matter because no one knew her well enough to miss her voice. But lying here in the dark, in this cold house on the edge of the world, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. She thought about Thomas, about the way he'd held her sister, about the words he'd spoken when he'd finally noticed Eleanor standing in the doorway. It didn't mean anything. You're overreacting. Why won't you just talk to me? But the words wouldn't come then, and they wouldn't come now, and Eleanor was beginning to fear they never would again. She pressed her hand over her mouth and felt the silent scream trapped inside her throat, sharp and desperate and endless. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she'd try harder. She'd find a way to communicate, to prove herself useful, to earn her place here. She'd learn to live with the silence. She'd learn to be enough, even without words. Tomorrow. But tonight, she let herself cry, quiet, shaking sobs that no one could hear, and wondered if she'd ever feel whole again. Morning came cold and bright, the sun rising over the mountains in a wash of pink and gold. Eleanor woke to a knock on her door and Abigail's cheerful voice calling, "Mrs. Eleanor, breakfast is ready." She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes, a plain brown wool dress, her thick stockings, her worn boots, and braided her dark hair into a simple plait. The mirror over the washstand showed her a woman she barely recognized, pale, thin, with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. But she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and went downstairs. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and frying bacon. Abigail was setting the table, and Jacob stood at the stove flipping flapjacks with easy competence. He looked up when she entered and smiled. "Morning, Mrs. Price. Hope you slept well." She nodded, though it was a lie. "Papa already ate," Abigail announced. "He's out checking the fences. But Jacob makes the best flapjacks in Colorado, so you're not missing anything." Jacob laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the kitchen. High praise from a 7-year-old. They ate together, the three of them, and it felt almost normal. Jacob and Abigail kept up a steady stream of chatter about the horses, about the barn cat who'd just had kittens, about the time last winter when snow drifted so high they'd had to dig a tunnel to reach the barn. Eleanor listened, contributing nods and smiles, and found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since Chicago. After breakfast, Jacob saddled 3 horses, the sorrel mare for Eleanor, a gentle pinto pony for Abigail, and his buckskin for himself, and they set out across the ranch. The morning was crisp and clear, the air so cold it burned Eleanor's lungs, but the sky was endless and blue, and somehow the world felt bigger out here, like there was room to breathe, room to exist without apology. Jacob led them up toward the ridge, pointing out landmarks and explaining the layout of the ranch. "Daniel owns about 2,000 acres, he said. Most of it's grazing land for the cattle, but there's good water from the creek and timber up in the high country. Been in his family for 20 years. His father was one of the first settlers in this valley." They crested the ridge, and Eleanor gasped, actually gasped, the sound punching out of her before she could stop it. The valley spread out below them like something from a painting, endless rolling grassland dotted with cattle, the creek winding through like a silver ribbon, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks catching the morning sun and glowing like they'd been set on fire. It was beautiful, achingly, impossibly beautiful. "Something, isn't it?" Jacob said softly, watching her face. "I come up here sometimes when I need to remember why I love this place. When the work gets hard or the winter feels too long. I come up here and I remember." Eleanor turned to him, and for a moment their eyes met and held. Something passed between them, some wordless understanding, some recognition of shared loneliness, shared longing for something better, something whole. Then Abigail called out, "Look, is that an eagle?" And the moment broke. They rode for another hour, circling back toward the ranch through meadows where frost still clung to the grass and the horse's breath made clouds in the cold air. Jacob showed them where wild strawberries grew in summer, where the best fishing spots were along the creek, where to watch for rattlesnakes come spring. And slowly, gradually, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to thaw. Not her voice, that remained locked away, silent and stubborn, but something else, some tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here, that maybe silence didn't have to mean emptiness, that maybe she could find a way to belong, even without words. When they returned to the ranch, Daniel was waiting in the yard, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Price," he said, his tone formal, "I need you to start on the washing today, and Abigail needs her lessons. Jacob has work to do." The warmth drained out of the morning like water through a sieve. Eleanor dismounted, nodded once, and followed Abigail toward the house. But at the door, she glanced back. Jacob was watching her, his gray-blue eyes soft and concerned, and when their gazes met, he smiled, small and private, just for her. And Eleanor felt that tiny spark of hope flicker a little brighter. The days settled into a rhythm, though calling it comfortable would have been a lie. Eleanor rose before dawn each morning, her breath misting in the cold bedroom air, and dressed by the thin light that crept through her window. She'd make her way downstairs to find the kitchen still dark, the house wrapped in that particular silence that comes just before the world wakes up. She learned to move quietly through Daniel Hale's house, learned where the floorboards creaked and which drawer stuck when you opened it. She learned that Daniel took his coffee black and strong, that Abigail liked her eggs scrambled but not too dry, that Jacob always knocked softly before entering and never failed to say thank you. The work was endless. Washing clothes in the frigid water from the pump, her hands turning raw and red despite the lye soap, scrubbing floors until her knees ached, mending shirts and trousers by lamplight while Abigail practiced her letters at the kitchen table, cooking meals that Daniel ate in silence, his eyes distant, his thoughts somewhere Eleanor couldn't follow. She existed in the spaces between words, communicating through gestures and nods, through the language of completed tasks and clean surfaces. Abigail had adapted quickly to Eleanor's silence, chattering enough for both of them, asking questions that required only yes or no answers. The child would climb into Eleanor's lap while she mended, telling elaborate stories about the barn cats or her imaginary friend who lived in the hayloft, and Eleanor would stroke her hair and listen, her heart aching with a tenderness she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. But Daniel remained distant. He was never cruel. Jacob had been right about that, but neither was he warm. He spoke to Eleanor only when necessary, issuing instructions or making requests, and always in that same flat, emotionless tone. She was a function to him, nothing more, a problem partially solved. It was Jacob who made the days bearable. He appeared at odd moments, bringing in firewood when the stack ran low, fixing the squeaky hinge on the pantry door, showing Abigail how to braid leather strips into a bridle while Eleanor prepared supper. He had a way of filling silence that didn't demand she break hers, talking easily about the horses or the weather or some story from his childhood in Kansas. "My grandfather raised me," he told her one afternoon while they worked together in the kitchen garden, pulling up the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze solid. Abigail was at school. Yes, there was a small schoolhouse in Millstone, and Daniel insisted his daughter attend when weather permitted. And Daniel had ridden out to check the far pasture. "My parents died of cholera when I was 8. Grandpa was a saddle maker, taught me everything about working with leather and horses. Said a man who understood animals would never want for work." Eleanor knelt in the cold earth, pulling carrots and placing them gently in the basket beside her. She glanced at Jacob, and he met her eyes with that soft, steady gaze that always made her feel seen in a way she couldn't explain. "He played the violin," Jacob continued, brushing dirt from a particularly large turnip. "Not well, mind you, but he loved it. Said music was the voice of the soul, and even a man who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket had a soul worth expressing." He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "I still have his violin, packed away in my cabin. Haven't touched it in years, but I can't seem to part with it." Eleanor wanted to ask about his grandfather, wanted to know what had happened to him, wanted to share her own story in return. But the words stayed locked inside, and all she could do was nod and hope he understood. He seemed to. Jacob always seemed to understand. The first snow came in early December, falling soft and silent through the night, and Eleanor woke to find the world transformed. Everything was white. The yard, the barn roof, the distant mountains, all of it wrapped in a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled in the early morning light like scattered diamonds. Abigail was beside herself with excitement, pressing her nose against the kitchen window. Can we build a snowman? Can we? Please? Daniel, already dressed for outdoor work, shook his head. I need to check on the cattle, make sure they're weathering the cold. And you have lessons. The light died in Abigail's eyes. Yes, Papa. But Jacob, pulling on his heavy coat by the door, caught Eleanor's eye and winked. Tell you what, Abby, if you work hard on your lessons this morning, maybe this afternoon Mrs. Price would let you go out for a bit. I'll be back from the north pasture by then. We could all build a snowman together. Really? Abigail spun toward Eleanor, her face blazing with hope. Can we? Eleanor smiled and nodded. The child's joy was infectious, impossible to resist. Papa? Abigail turned to Daniel for permission. He was already heading out the door, but he paused and looked back. His eyes moved from Abigail to Eleanor to Jacob, and something flickered in his expression, something Eleanor couldn't quite read. Fine, but lessons first, and don't let her catch cold. Yes, Papa. Abigail threw her arms around Eleanor's waist, squeezing tight. Thank you, thank you. That afternoon, true to his word, Jacob returned as the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains. Eleanor had bundled Abigail in every warm thing the child owned: 2 pairs of stockings, a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck, mittens, and a knit cap that covered her ears. I look like a bear, Abigail giggled, waddling toward the door. Eleanor's lips curved in a smile. She'd wrapped herself warmly, too, though her coat was thin and her gloves had holes in the fingertips. But she didn't care. The prospect of stepping outside, of doing something just for joy instead of duty, made her feel lighter than she had in months. Jacob met them in the yard, already rolling a large ball of snow. Got a head start, he called. Come on, Abby, help me with the base. They worked together, the 3 of them, rolling snow and packing it firm, building a snowman that was slightly lopsided but charming nonetheless. Abigail found stones for eyes and a crooked stick for a mouth, and Jacob produced a battered hat from somewhere and placed it on the snowman's head with exaggerated ceremony. There, he announced, most handsome fellow in Colorado. Abigail dissolved into giggles, and even Eleanor felt laughter bubble up in her chest, silent but real, warming her from the inside. Your turn, Mrs. Price, Jacob said, scooping up a handful of snow and forming it into a loose ball. His eyes sparkled with mischief. Ever had a snowball fight? Eleanor's eyes widened. She shook her head quickly, backing away. Oh, this is going to be fun, Jacob grinned. Abby, help me teach Mrs. Price about the fine art of snow warfare. What followed was pure, uncomplicated joy. Abigail shrieked with laughter as she and Jacob pelted Eleanor with soft snowballs, and Eleanor surprised herself by fighting back, her aim terrible, but her determination fierce. They chased each other around the yard, slipping and sliding, until all 3 of them were breathless and covered in snow and grinning like fools. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from somewhere deep in your belly and made your sides ache. She couldn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook and her eyes watered, and for a few perfect moments she forgot about Chicago and Thomas and the terrible silence that had swallowed her voice. She forgot to be afraid. When they finally collapsed in the snow, exhausted and freezing, Jacob lay on his back beside her, his breath coming in clouds, and said, You should smile more often, Mrs. Price. It suits you. Eleanor turned her head to look at him. His hat had come off during the battle, and his brown hair was dusted with snow, his cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. He looked happy, peaceful. And when their eyes met, something passed between them again, that same wordless current of understanding, of connection. Eleanor felt her heart beat faster, felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold, and for the first time in 8 months, she wished desperately that she could speak, if only to tell this kind cowboy with the storm-colored eyes how much these small moments meant to her. But then Abigail was pulling at her hand, begging to make snow angels, and the moment passed. They went inside as the sun touched the mountains, their clothes soaked and their fingers numb, and Eleanor made hot cocoa while Jacob built up the fire. Abigail fell asleep on the sofa, her head on Eleanor's lap, and the house felt almost warm, almost like a home. Daniel returned after dark, snow clinging to his coat, his face drawn and tired. He looked at the three of them, Abigail asleep, Jacob stoking the fire, Eleanor watching from the kitchen, and something shifted in his expression. "The cattle are fine," he said quietly. "Lost one calf to the cold, but the rest are holding up." "I'm sorry about the calf," Jacob replied. Daniel shrugged. "Part of ranching." He looked at Eleanor then, really looked at her, and for a moment his face softened, almost imperceptibly. "Thank you for keeping Abigail entertained. She seems happy." Eleanor nodded, uncertain how to read this version of Daniel, less stern, more human. He paused, seeming to search for words. "I'll try to be back for supper tomorrow. On time." It wasn't much, but it felt like something. The weeks folded into each other, and winter dug in deep. The temperature dropped until water froze in the basin overnight, until the wind howled like a living thing around the corners of the house. Snow fell almost daily, piling in drifts against the barn, making even short trips outside an ordeal. Eleanor learned to navigate the confined world of the ranch house, learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, learned to read the subtle shifts in Daniel's mood and Jacob's silences, and Abigail's boundless energy. She taught the child her letters and numbers, using a slate and chalk to write out lessons, communicating through written words when gestures weren't enough. Abigail proved to be a quick study, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. "Mama used to read to me every night," she told Eleanor one evening, snuggled close under a shared blanket while the wind screamed outside. "Stories about princesses and knights and magic. Do you know any stories like that?" Eleanor hesitated, then reached for the slate. She wrote carefully, "I could try to write some for you." Abigail's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd write stories just for me?" Eleanor nodded, and the child's face lit up with such pure delight that Eleanor felt her chest tighten. That night, after Abigail had gone to bed, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a precious piece of paper and a pencil Jacob had sharpened for her, and she began to write. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, but then they began to flow. She wrote about a girl who lived in a castle made of ice, who had lost her voice to a wicked enchantment but learned to speak through music and kindness and love. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the fire had burned down to embers, until she'd poured out something that felt almost like healing onto the page. When she finally climbed the stairs to her cold bedroom, she found Jacob sitting on the porch despite the freezing temperature, his collar turned up against the wind. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Too quiet inside my head." Eleanor understood that. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight, and sat beside him on the wooden bench. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching their breath make clouds in the moonlight. Then Jacob spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know what I think, Mrs. Price? I think silence isn't always about not having words. Sometimes it's about having too many words and no safe place to put them." He turned to look at her. "I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I think Daniel's a damn fool if he can't see that." Eleanor's breath caught. She stared at him, this cowboy who'd shown her nothing but gentleness, who seemed to see straight into the wounded places she kept hidden, and felt tears prick her eyes. Jacob reached over and very gently took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip steady. "Whatever happened to you before you came here, whatever stole your voice, it doesn't define you. You're not broken, Eleanor. You're just healing." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his voice, soft and careful and kind, made something crack inside her chest. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another, and suddenly she was crying in earnest, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Jacob pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her, and let her cry against his shoulder. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He just held her while she wept for everything she'd lost. Her voice, her trust, her belief that the world could be good and safe and kind. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor pulled back, embarrassed. But Jacob just handed her his handkerchief and smiled that gentle smile. "Feel better?" She nodded, and realized that she did. She felt lighter, cleaner, like something poisonous had been drawn out. "Good." Jacob stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, it's too cold out here. Let's get you inside before you freeze." She let him help her up, and his hand lingered in hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Christmas came, marked by a small pine tree that Jacob cut and dragged in from the timber stand, which Abigail decorated with paper chains and dried apple slices. Eleanor baked cookies using precious sugar and butter, and Jacob carved small wooden animals for Abigail: a horse, a barn cat, a bird. Daniel gave his daughter a new doll with a porcelain face, and Eleanor gave her the story she'd written, copied carefully onto good paper and folded into a little book. Abigail cried when she read it, then threw her arms around Eleanor. "It's the best present I've ever gotten. Ever." For Eleanor, the gifts were simpler but no less meaningful. Daniel gave her a bolt of warm wool fabric for a new dress, practical but thoughtful. Abigail gave her a drawing of the four of them standing in front of the house, stick figures holding hands. But it was Jacob's gift that made her hands tremble. He presented her with a small wooden box carved with flowers and vines, and when she opened it, she found his grandfather's violin. "I want you to have it," he said quietly. "I think music might be another way for you to speak, and I think Grandpa would have liked you." Eleanor stared at the instrument, its wood worn smooth with age and use, and felt her eyes well with tears. She looked up at Jacob, trying to convey through her expression what she couldn't say with words: how much this meant, how much he meant. Jacob seemed to understand. He always did. That night, after Abigail had gone to bed and Daniel had retired to his study with his ledgers, Eleanor held the violin for the first time. She'd learned to play as a girl. Her mother had insisted on it, said music was a necessary accomplishment for young ladies, but she hadn't touched an instrument in years. Her fingers found the strings, and the first notes were rough, uncertain. But then muscle memory took over, and she played Silent Night, the carol soft and sweet in the quiet house. When she finished, she looked up to find Jacob standing in the doorway, his eyes bright with something that looked almost like wonder. "Beautiful," he whispered. "You're beautiful." And Eleanor knew he wasn't talking about the music. January brought storms that buried the ranch under feet of snow. The world shrank to just the house and the barn, connected by a rope Jacob strung between them so no one would get lost in the whiteouts. They lived on stored food and melted snow and the warmth of the fire, days blending together in a haze of cold and dim lamplight. Daniel grew restless, pacing the house like a caged animal. "I should be checking the cattle," he'd mutter. "Should be reinforcing the shelters. Should be—" "You'd die before you got 100 yards, Jacob said bluntly. "We all stay put until this clears." Being confined together, the four of them changed something. The proximity forced a kind of intimacy, shared meals, shared chores, shared long evenings when there was nothing to do but talk or play games or listen to Eleanor play the violin. Abigail bloomed under the attention, and even Daniel began to thaw slightly. He told stories about his childhood, about building this ranch with his father, about meeting his wife at a church social in Denver. "She was like sunshine," he said one night, his voice soft with memory. "Walked into a room and everything got brighter. She loved this place, loved the mountains and the sky and the way the wind sounded. She used to sing while she worked." His eyes found Eleanor's. "You remind me of her sometimes, the way you move quiet through the house, the way Abigail takes to you." It was the kindest thing he'd ever said to her, but Eleanor saw the way his gaze would drift to the empty chair at dinner, the way he'd touch his wedding ring when he thought no one was looking. Daniel Hale was still married to a ghost, and Eleanor understood that she would never be more than a convenience to him, someone to care for his daughter and keep his house, but never someone to love. The realization should have hurt more than it did, but when she looked across the room and found Jacob watching her with those storm-colored eyes, his expression tender and open, she realized her heart had already made its choice without asking permission. She was falling in love with the cowboy who taught her that silence could be strength instead of shame. The thought terrified her. One evening, when the storm had finally broken and the stars appeared like ice chips in the black sky, Eleanor slipped outside. She needed air, needed space, needed to think. She stood in the snow-covered yard, her breath misting, and stared up at the vast sweep of the Milky Way. Out here, the stars were so bright they cast shadows. Out here, the world felt infinite and impossible and somehow holy. You'll freeze if you stay out too long. Jacob's voice was quiet behind her. Eleanor turned to find him standing on the porch, wrapped in his heavy coat, his expression concerned. She managed a small smile and gestured at the sky, trying to convey how beautiful it was, how she'd needed to see it. Jacob came down the steps and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. First winter out here, I'd come out every clear night just to look at the stars. Couldn't believe how many there were. Made me feel small, but in a good way. Like my problems weren't so big after all. Eleanor nodded. She understood that feeling exactly. They stood together in companionable silence, and then Jacob said very softly, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped. She turned to face him fully. Jacob took a breath, his expression serious. "I know you're here as Daniel's, as his intended companion. And I know I have no right to complicate things, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I've been falling since the day I met you at the stage. And I know it's wrong and impossible, and I should keep my mouth shut, but I can't lie to you. I can't pretend." Eleanor's breath stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. She stared at Jacob, at this good, kind man who'd shown her nothing but gentleness, and felt her own heart crying out with everything she couldn't say. "I love you too. I love you too. I love you too." But the words wouldn't come. Jacob seemed to read the answer in her eyes anyway. He stepped closer, raised his hand, and very gently cupped her cheek. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." Eleanor reached up and covered his hand with hers, pressing it closer. Then, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, barely more than a touch of lips, but it felt like the entire world shifted on its axis. When she pulled back, Jacob's eyes were wide, his expression stunned. Then he smiled, slow and wondering and full of joy, and pulled her close, kissing her properly this time. His lips were warm despite the cold, and he tasted like coffee and hope and all the words she couldn't speak. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest and felt his arms wrap around her, solid and safe. "We'll figure this out," Jacob whispered into her hair. "I don't know how, but we will. I promise." Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself believe him. The next morning, everything changed. Daniel announced at breakfast that he'd be riding into town, the roads were finally clear enough, and that he'd be bringing back a guest for supper. "Who?" Abigail asked, excited at the prospect of company. Daniel's expression was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Virginia Cole. She's recently widowed, moved to Millstone last fall. We've been corresponding." The words dropped like stones into still water. Eleanor felt her stomach clench. "Is she nice?" Abigail pressed. "Very nice, very proper." Daniel looked at Eleanor then, and something in his eyes made her blood run cold. "I think you'll like her, Abigail. And Mrs. Price, I'll expect you to prepare a suitable supper. Mrs. Cole she's an educated woman. From Philadelphia. We should make a good impression." Eleanor nodded numbly, her mind racing. Corresponding. Recently widowed. Make a good impression. She understood what was happening. Daniel was moving on, finding someone better suited to be a rancher's wife, someone with a voice, with refinement, with all the things Eleanor lacked. After Daniel left, Eleanor went through the motions of her morning chores in a daze. Jacob found her in the kitchen, staring at nothing, and touched her arm gently. "Hey, you all right?" She shook her head. No, she wasn't all right at all. "Daniel's a fool," Jacob said quietly, fiercely. "Whatever he's thinking, whatever he's planning, he's a fool." But Eleanor knew it didn't matter. She was a mail-order bride who couldn't speak, living in a house where she'd never be more than convenient. And now Daniel had found someone else, someone better, and Eleanor would be... what? Cast aside? Expected to leave? Where would she even go? The panic rose in her throat, familiar and suffocating. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. Jacob pulled her close, his arms strong and steady. "Listen to me. Whatever happens, you're not alone. You hear me, Eleanor? You're not alone." She wanted to believe him, but as she stood in his embrace, listening to the wind howl outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fragile new life was about to shatter into pieces too small to put back together. Eleanor spent the rest of the morning in a state of controlled panic, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind spun in desperate circles. She kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary, the rhythm doing nothing to calm the storm building in her chest. Virginia Cole, a widow from Philadelphia, educated, proper, everything Eleanor wasn't and could never be. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she'd known from the beginning this arrangement with Daniel was purely practical, that she'd never harbored any real hope of becoming his wife in more than name. But the thought of being replaced, of watching another woman take her place at the table, in Abigail's life, in this house she'd begun to think of as home, it made her feel hollow and sick. And beneath that fear ran another current, darker and more complicated. Relief. Because if Daniel chose Virginia Cole, then maybe Eleanor could stop pretending. Maybe she could acknowledge what had been growing between her and Jacob, what had bloomed that night under the stars when he'd kissed her like she was something precious. But where would that leave her? A woman with no voice, no money, no family, dependent on the charity of a cowboy who worked another man's ranch? Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pinched with worry. "Mrs. Eleanor, are you sad?" Eleanor looked up from the bread dough, realized her cheeks were wet, and quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She forced a smile and shook her head, but Abigail wasn't fooled. The child crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist, pressing her face against Eleanor's apron. "I don't want you to leave," she whispered, "even if Papa likes Mrs. Cole. I don't want you to go away." Eleanor's heart cracked. She set down the dough, knelt so she was eye level with Abigail, and pulled the girl close. She wished desperately that she could speak, could reassure this child who'd already lost so much, could promise that everything would be all right. But she couldn't make promises she might not be able to keep. Instead, she held Abigail tight and let the child cry against her shoulder, and tried not to think about how many more goodbyes might be waiting in her future. Daniel returned just after noon, riding beside a sleek black buggy driven by a woman who could only be Virginia Cole. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as they pulled into the yard, her stomach twisting into knots. Mrs. Cole was beautiful. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see that. She wore a deep green traveling dress that looked expensive, and her dark hair was arranged in elaborate curls beneath a fashionable hat. When Daniel helped her down from the buggy, she laughed at something he said, a bright musical sound that carried across the yard, and touched his arm with easy familiarity. Eleanor turned away from the window, her hands shaking. She smoothed down her plain brown dress, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and tried to compose herself. The front door opened and Daniel's voice filled the house. "Mrs. Price? We're here." Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped into the main room. Virginia Cole stood in the center, pulling off her gloves, and when she saw Eleanor, her smile widened. "You must be Mrs. Price." She crossed the room with graceful steps and extended her hand. "Daniel has told me so much about you. What a lovely home you keep." Eleanor shook her hand, managing a small nod. Up close, Virginia was even more striking, fine-boned and elegant, with intelligent dark eyes and perfect teeth. She looked like she belonged in a drawing room in Philadelphia, not a ranch house in Colorado. "Mrs. Cole will be joining us for supper," Daniel said, his tone carefully formal. "I thought it would be nice for her to meet Abigail properly, and to see how we manage things here." "Of course," Virginia said warmly. "I've been so curious about ranch life. It's all so different from what I'm accustomed to." She looked around the room, and Eleanor saw her taking in every detail, the worn furniture, the simple curtains, the practical lack of decoration. "But there's a certain charm to it, isn't there? So rustic." The word stung, though Eleanor couldn't say why. Abigail appeared on the stairs, descending slowly, her earlier enthusiasm for company clearly dampened. "Hello?" she said quietly. "And you must be Abigail." Virginia swept toward her, bending slightly. "What a pretty girl you are. Your father has told me you're very clever with your letters." "Mrs. Eleanor teaches me," Abigail said, moving to stand beside Eleanor, her small hand finding Eleanor's. Virginia's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. "How wonderful. Daniel mentioned that Mrs. Price has been filling in, temporarily. The word hung in the air like a threat. Temporarily. Eleanor felt Abigail's hand tighten in hers. Perhaps, Virginia continued, straightening, once things are more settled, Abigail could attend a proper school. There's a boarding academy in Denver that comes highly recommended. A young lady needs proper education, proper refinement. I don't want to go to Denver, Abigail said, her voice small but firm. I want to stay here, with Mrs. Eleanor. Oh, darling, Virginia's laugh was light but condescending. You don't know what you want yet, but don't worry, we'll figure it all out. Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. We. As if it were already decided. As if Virginia Cole had already claimed her place in this house, in this family. Daniel cleared his throat. Why don't we all sit down, Mrs. Price? Perhaps you could make tea. It was a dismissal. Eleanor nodded and retreated to the kitchen, her face burning. She put the kettle on with trembling hands and tried to steady her breathing. Through the doorway, she could hear Virginia's voice, bright and animated, telling some story about Philadelphia society. Daniel's occasional responses were warmer than Eleanor had ever heard them. She was setting out the tea things when Jacob came in through the back door, stamping snow from his boots. He took one look at her face and crossed the room in 3 strides. What happened? Eleanor shook her head, unable to explain even if she could speak. Jacob glanced toward the main room, where Virginia's laughter rang out again. His jaw tightened. She's here. Eleanor nodded miserably. Eleanor. Jacob's voice was low and urgent. He took her hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. Whatever Daniel's planning, whatever he's thinking, you have choices. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to. You don't have to accept being pushed aside. But what choices did she really have? Eleanor pulled her hands free and returned to preparing the tea, her movements mechanical. Jacob watched her for a long moment, frustration and concern warring in his expression. Then he said quietly, I meant what I said the other night. All of it. That hasn't changed. The kettle whistled, sharp and insistent. Eleanor poured the boiling water over the tea leaves, focusing on the simple task, and tried not to let hope take root in her chest. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. She carried the tea tray into the main room. Virginia sat on the sofa beside Daniel, close enough that their arms almost touched, while Abigail perched stiffly in a chair across from them. The child's face brightened when she saw Eleanor. Thank you, Mrs. Price, Daniel said, not meeting her eyes. Eleanor set down the tray and moved to retreat, but Virginia spoke up. Oh, do stay for a moment. I'd love to hear about your journey west. Daniel mentioned you came from Chicago? Eleanor froze. She looked at Daniel, who finally met her gaze with something that might have been apology or might have been guilt. Mrs. Price doesn't speak, he said quietly. Virginia's eyebrows rose. Doesn't speak? You mean she's mute? She can speak, Abigail interjected fiercely. She just doesn't want to right now, but she talks other ways. She writes things, and she plays music, and... How unusual, Virginia interrupted, her tone fascinated but not unkind. Some sort of nervous condition? Eleanor felt her face flame. She wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear, to be anywhere but here, being discussed like a curiosity. It's a personal matter, Daniel said, some of his usual sternness returning. And not really relevant to... Of course. Of course. Virginia waved her hand dismissively. I didn't mean to pry. It must be quite challenging, though, running a household without being able to give proper instructions or communicate efficiently. The implication was clear. Eleanor wasn't adequate. Couldn't be adequate. Not like Virginia Cole with her cultured voice and easy confidence. Jacob appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor had never been more grateful for anyone's presence. His eyes found hers immediately, steady and reassuring. Daniel, the cattle in the north pasture need checking. Storm damage to one of the shelter walls. Daniel stood, looking almost relieved to have an excuse to leave. I'll come look. Virginia, if you'll excuse me. Of course. Virginia smiled up at him. I'll just get to know Abigail better. Perhaps she can show me around the house? Abigail looked mutinous, but Daniel gave her a warning look. Mind your manners, Abigail. The men left, and Eleanor found herself alone with Virginia and a resentful 7-year-old. The silence stretched awkward and heavy. Virginia sipped her tea, then set down the cup with a delicate clink. Well, Abigail, why don't you tell me about yourself? What do you like to do? I like being with Mrs. Eleanor, Abigail said stubbornly, and Jacob, and the horses, and learning my letters and numbers. And when Mrs. Eleanor plays the violin at night, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Virginia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. How lovely! Though a violin seems like quite a luxury for a ranch house, hardly practical. It was a gift, Abigail said, from Jacob's grandfather, and Mrs. Eleanor plays it perfectly. She plays better than anyone. I'm sure she does. Virginia's tone suggested she was merely humoring a child. She turned her attention to Eleanor, who stood frozen by the doorway. You know, Mrs. Price, I do hope you're not too attached to this arrangement. I'm sure you understand that Daniel needs someone who can properly manage his household and provide the right sort of guidance for Abigail. Someone who can speak with neighbors, handle business matters, represent the family appropriately. Eleanor felt the words like physical blows. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet Virginia's gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. Virginia stood, smoothing her skirts. I don't mean to be unkind, truly, but we must be practical. A ranch is a business, after all, and businesses require clear communication. She paused, then added with what seemed like genuine sympathy, I'm sure there are other situations that would be more suitable for someone in your condition. Perhaps a position that doesn't require speech, a laundress or seamstress, perhaps. The suggestion hung in the air, and Eleanor felt something inside her crumble. She'd known it was coming, had sensed the inevitable moment when she'd be deemed insufficient, but hearing it spoken aloud made it unbearably real. Abigail jumped to her feet, her small face fierce. Mrs. Eleanor isn't going anywhere. She belongs here. She takes care of me and Papa and... Abigail, Virginia's voice was sharp. That's quite enough. Children don't make decisions about household staff. She's not staff, Abigail's voice rose. But she couldn't finish, because what was Eleanor exactly? Not a wife, not family, not quite a servant, but not quite anything else either. She existed in some undefined space, and now that space was being erased. Eleanor couldn't bear it anymore. She turned and fled to the kitchen, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle the sobs that wanted to break free, silent but wrenching. She heard footsteps behind her, small, quick ones, and then Abigail was there, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's waist and crying too. Don't go, the child sobbed. Please don't go. I need you. I love you. Eleanor sank to her knees and held Abigail tight, rocking her, both of them crying together in the cold kitchen while Virginia Cole's voice drifted in from the main room, already sounding like she owned the place. The supper that evening was the most uncomfortable meal Eleanor had ever endured. Virginia sat in what had become Eleanor's usual seat, chatting easily with Daniel about Philadelphia society, ranch management, and her late husband's business ventures. She was intelligent and articulate, her observations sharp, her manner charming. Daniel responded with more animation than Eleanor had seen from him in weeks. He smiled, he laughed. He looked at Virginia like she was bringing light back into his dark world. Eleanor served the meal she'd spent hours preparing, roasted chicken, root vegetables, fresh bread, apple pie, and received barely a glance of acknowledgement. Jacob, who joined them at Daniel's insistence, caught her eye several times with expressions of sympathy and frustration, but he couldn't do anything to change the dynamics at the table. Abigail picked at her food, her earlier defiance replaced by miserable silence. This chicken is delicious, Virginia said at one point, her tone gracious. You're an excellent cook, Mrs. Price. That's certainly a valuable skill. A valuable skill for a servant, the implication went. After supper, while Eleanor was clearing the table, Virginia called out, Oh, Abigail mentioned that you play the violin, Mrs. Price. Would you mind playing something for us? I do love music. Eleanor froze with a stack of plates in her hands. She looked at Jacob, who gave a tiny shake of his head. Don't do it, his expression said. You don't owe them anything. But Daniel was already speaking. Yes, that would be nice. Mrs. Cole is quite a connoisseur of the arts. Eleanor had no choice. She set down the plates, retrieved the violin from where she kept it near the hearth, and positioned herself by the window. Her hands were shaking as she raised the instrument. She closed her eyes and began to play. She chose a piece her mother had taught her years ago, a sad, haunting melody that spoke of longing and loss. As her bow moved across the strings, Eleanor poured everything she couldn't say into the music. All her fear, all her sorrow, all her desperate love for this place and these people, and the cowboy who'd shown her that silence could be beautiful. The notes filled the room, rich and pure, and for those few minutes, Eleanor forgot about Virginia Cole and Daniel's cold practicality and her own uncertain future. There was only the music and the way it gave voice to her voiceless heart. When the final note faded, silence hung heavy in the room. Eleanor opened her eyes to find Abigail crying quietly, tears streaming down her face. Jacob's expression was raw and unguarded, his eyes bright with emotion. Even Daniel looked moved, though he quickly schooled his features back to neutrality. Virginia applauded politely. "How lovely. You have real talent, Mrs. Price. Such a shame to waste it out here in the middle of nowhere. In Philadelphia, you could have performed in proper concerts." But Eleanor heard what Virginia wasn't saying, that she didn't belong here, that her talent, like everything else about her, was somehow wrong for this place, for this life. She lowered the violin, nodded once, and retreated to the kitchen. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to be anywhere but here. She slipped out the back door into the cold night, leaving the violin on the table, and walked blindly across the yard. The moon was nearly full, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of silver and blue. Her breath came in clouds, and within moments her fingers were numb, but she didn't care. She heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind her and knew without turning that it was Jacob. "Eleanor." His voice was gentle but firm. "Come inside before you freeze." She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. Jacob came up beside her, shrugging out of his heavy coat and draping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still heated from his body, made her shiver. "That woman," he said, his voice tight with anger, "has no right to make you feel small. And Daniel's a damned fool if he thinks she's worth half of what you are." Eleanor turned to face him, and in the moonlight she could see the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides like he wanted to fight someone but had no one to fight. "Come with me," Jacob said suddenly, urgently. "Tonight, right now. We'll take the horses and go. I've got some money saved. We could make it to Denver, find you a position somewhere. Start fresh where nobody knows us, and nobody can—" Eleanor pressed her fingers against his lips, stopping the words. As much as she wanted to say yes, wanted to run away with him into the night, she couldn't. There was Abigail to consider, and where would they go? What kind of life could they build when she had nothing and he had only a cowboy's wages? "I know," Jacob said, reading her thoughts. "I know it's not practical. I know we should be sensible and careful and think things through." He took her hand, pressed it against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. "But I can't watch him replace you. I can't watch you disappear like you don't matter when you matter more than anything." Eleanor felt her resolve cracking. She wanted so badly to believe him, to believe that love could be enough, that they could find a way. But then the back door opened and Daniel's voice cut through the night. "Jacob, Mrs. Price, what are you doing out here?" They sprang apart like guilty children. Daniel stood on the porch, his silhouette dark against the light spilling from the house, and even from this distance Eleanor could sense his displeasure. "Mrs. Price needed some air," Jacob said evenly. "I was making sure she didn't wander too far in the cold." Daniel's silence was heavy with suspicion. Then he said, "Mrs. Cole is leaving. She expects proper farewells. Mrs. Price, you should come inside." It was an order, not a request. Eleanor shrugged out of Jacob's coat, though every fiber of her being wanted to keep it, keep his warmth, keep this moment, and handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed, and Jacob squeezed her hand once before letting go. She walked back to the house on legs that felt like wood, feeling Daniel's eyes on her the whole way. Inside, Virginia was pulling on her gloves, her expression pleasant, but her eyes calculating. She'd seen something, Eleanor realized, had watched them through the window, perhaps, had noted the way Jacob looked at Eleanor, and the way Eleanor looked back. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Virginia said to the room at large. Then, directly to Eleanor, And thank you for that beautiful music, Mrs. Price. You should treasure that gift. Music can open many doors, even for those who cannot speak." She paused, then added with seemingly casual interest, "I understand there are some families in Denver looking for music teachers. Private instruction for their daughters. Perhaps I could make some inquiries on your behalf?" The suggestion was layered with meaning. Virginia was offering her an out, a way to leave gracefully, with dignity and purpose. Or perhaps she was simply trying to get rid of the competition, such as it was. Eleanor managed a small nod, though her stomach churned. Daniel walked Virginia out to her buggy, and through the window Eleanor watched them talk in low voices, their heads close together. At one point, Virginia laughed and touched Daniel's arm, and he smiled down at her with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face before. He looked happy. Genuinely happy. Eleanor turned away, her heart aching. Abigail appeared at her side, silent and solemn. She slipped her hand into Eleanor's and leaned against her, seeking comfort. Eleanor stroked the child's hair and tried not to think about how many more nights they'd have like this, how soon it might all end. Jacob came back inside, his face carefully blank, and began banking the fire for the night. He didn't look at Eleanor, but she felt the weight of his presence, the unspoken connection between them that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Daniel returned, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked at the three of them, Eleanor, Abigail, and Jacob, and something complicated passed across his face. "Abigail, time for bed," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Will Mrs. Eleanor tuck me in?" Abigail asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but then she and I need to have a discussion." The word sent dread cascading through Eleanor's chest. She took Abigail upstairs, helped her into her nightgown, and listened to the child's prayers. When Abigail asked God to please let Mrs. Eleanor stay forever, Eleanor had to bite her lip to keep from crying. She kissed the child's forehead and smoothed back her hair, memorizing the feeling in case this was one of the last times she'd get to do it. Downstairs, Daniel waited by the fire, his expression unreadable. Jacob had disappeared, probably to his cabin, giving them privacy Eleanor didn't want. She stood in the doorway, waiting for the axe to fall. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mrs. Price, Eleanor, we need to discuss our arrangement." Eleanor's hands clenched in her skirts. She nodded for him to continue. "When I sent for you, I thought I knew what I needed. Someone practical, someone to help with Abigail and the house, someone—" He paused, searching for words. "Someone I wouldn't have to explain my grief to. Someone who wouldn't expect me to be anything other than what I am." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding. "But, Virginia, Mrs. Cole, she's—" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. "She reminds me of Sarah, my late wife. She has that same light, that same ease with words and people. And Abigail needs more than I can give her. She needs refinement, education, a woman who can teach her how to move in society." There it was, the confirmation of everything Eleanor had feared. "You've been good to my daughter," Daniel continued. "And you work hard. But this isn't fair to you, is it? Trapped here in the middle of nowhere, unable to speak, taking care of another woman's child." He met her eyes finally. "Virginia mentioned positions in Denver, teaching music. That might be better suited to your situation." Eleanor stared at him, feeling numb. He was doing it kindly, with consideration even, but he was still pushing her out. Making room for Virginia Cole to step into the space Eleanor had briefly occupied. She wanted to argue, to fight, to make him see that she loved Abigail, that she'd built something here worth keeping. But even if she could find her voice, what would she say? That she'd fallen in love with his hired hand instead of him? That her presence here was based on a lie because she'd never intended to be his wife in any real sense? Daniel was offering her an escape. Perhaps she should take it. She nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. "We'll work something out," Daniel said, relief flickering across his face. "Give it a few weeks. Let Virginia and I let things develop properly. And then we'll arrange transportation to Denver, help you get established. You'll have references, of course, and payment for your time here." Money for services rendered, as if she were simply another ranch hand whose employment had run its course. Eleanor nodded again, then turned and walked up the stairs to her cold little room. She closed the door, sank onto the bed, and stared at the wall. She should feel something: anger, sadness, betrayal. But all she felt was tired, so deeply, profoundly tired. Tomorrow she would have to figure out what came next. Tomorrow she would have to be strong and practical and make plans. But tonight, she just sat in the dark and tried to remember who she'd been before silence had stolen her voice, before betrayal had stolen her trust, before coming west had given her a glimpse of something beautiful that was already slipping through her fingers like water. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around her, and tried to imagine a future that made sense. Denver. Teaching music to wealthy daughters who would look at her with curiosity or pity when they realized she couldn't speak. Living in some boarding house, alone, surviving on whatever wages she could earn. It was practical. It was sensible. It was a kind of death. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Eleanor rose and dressed mechanically. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 26 years, dark circles under her eyes, hollow cheeks, lips pressed thin against words that would never come. She braided her hair with numb fingers and went downstairs to start the day's work, because what else was there to do? The kitchen was still dark, but someone had already started the fire. Eleanor found Jacob standing at the stove, his back to her, making coffee. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and the look on his face made her chest constrict. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. "Daniel told me last night about his plans." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup and nodded. "I want to say something, and I need you to just listen." Jacob set down his own cup and faced her fully. "I have about $300 saved. It's not much, but it's enough to get us to California, maybe Oregon. I can find work on any ranch. Good hands are always needed. You could teach music, or we could start small, find a little place." He paused, his voice roughening with emotion. "I know it's not much to offer. I know you deserve better than a drifter cowboy with nothing but what he can carry in his saddlebags. But Eleanor, I love you. And I can't stand the thought of you going to Denver alone, living some half-life teaching spoiled girls when you should be." Eleanor set down her cup and kissed him. She kissed him hard and desperate, pouring everything she couldn't say into the press of her lips against his. Jacob made a sound low in his throat and pulled her close, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing against the small of her back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" Eleanor pulled back just far enough to look into his eyes, those storm-colored eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness from the moment they'd met, and nodded. Yes. Whatever came next, whatever hardships they'd face, she wanted to face them with him. "We'll need to leave soon," Jacob said, his voice urgent now, planning. "Before the next big storm hits. I can get the horses ready, pack supplies. We could be gone by—" The back door opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and Abigail, who must have slipped out to check on the barn cats. She stopped dead when she saw them standing so close, Eleanor's hand still resting on Jacob's chest. "Mrs. Eleanor?" The child's voice was small and confused. "What's happening?" Eleanor's heart sank. She hadn't thought about this part, about saying goodbye to Abigail, about leaving the child who'd wound herself so completely around Eleanor's heart. Jacob recovered first. "Just having some coffee, Abby. You're up early." But Abigail wasn't fooled. Her eyes, too perceptive for a 7-year-old, moved between them. "Are you leaving? Both of you?" Eleanor knelt down, bringing herself to Abigail's level, and tried to convey through her expression what she couldn't say with words, that she didn't want to go, that leaving Abigail would break her heart, that sometimes adults had to make impossible choices. Abigail's face crumpled. No, you can't leave. I won't let you." She threw herself at Eleanor, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's neck with fierce desperation. "Papa's going to marry Mrs. Cole, isn't he? And then you'll go away and I'll be stuck with her and she'll send me to that school in Denver and I'll never see you again. And—" "Abby." Jacob crouched beside them, his voice gentle but firm. "Your papa wants what's best for you. Mrs. Cole, she's—" I don't want her. Abigail's voice rose to a wail. I want Mrs. Eleanor. She's the one who reads me stories and braids my hair and plays music, and she loves me. I know she does. And the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs silenced them all. Daniel appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day's work, his face dark with displeasure. What's all this noise? He took in the scene, Abigail clinging to Eleanor, Jacob standing too close, the tension thick enough to cut. Abigail, let go of Mrs. Price. No! Abigail's grip tightened. You're sending her away. You're going to marry Mrs. Cole and send me to boarding school, and I hate you. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Daniel's face went white, then red. Abigail Grace Hale, that is enough. Go to your room. Now. I won't. Now. Daniel's voice cracked like a whip, and Abigail flinched. She released Eleanor and ran from the room, her footsteps thundering up the stairs, followed by the slam of her bedroom door. Silence descended, heavy and awful. Eleanor slowly stood, her legs shaking. Daniel's jaw worked. He looked at Jacob, then at Eleanor, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. I think, he said slowly, carefully, that I've been blind to what's been happening under my own roof. Daniel, Jacob started, but Daniel held up a hand. How long? The question was quiet but sharp. How long have you two been carrying on behind my back? We haven't been carrying on, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the accusation. But I won't lie to you. I have feelings for Eleanor, and I believe she has feelings for me. But we've been nothing but proper. Daniel's laugh was bitter. You're in love with the woman I brought here to be my wife, and you call that proper? You don't want her as your wife, Jacob shot back, some of his own anger breaking through. You've made that clear enough. You've been courting Virginia Cole for weeks, planning to replace Eleanor like she's a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room. So don't stand there and act betrayed when someone else sees her worth. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually strike Jacob, but then he just shook his head, his expression shifting to something like disgust. I want you gone, he said to Jacob. Pack your things. You're no longer employed here. Eleanor's heart stopped. She grabbed Daniel's arm, shaking her head frantically, trying to convey that this was her fault, not Jacob's, that he shouldn't punish Jacob for her failures. Daniel pulled his arm free. Don't. You've done enough. He looked at her, and there was something almost like hurt beneath the anger. I gave you a home, treated you with respect, asked for nothing but that you care for my daughter and keep my house. And this is how you repay me? Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to explain, wanted to make him understand that she'd never meant to hurt him, that she'd tried so hard to be what he needed. But the words were locked away, useless, and all she could do was stand there while he judged her and found her wanting. Both of you, get out, Daniel said, his voice flat now, emotionless. I don't care where you go or what you do. Just be gone by tomorrow morning. He turned and walked out, leaving them standing in the kitchen as the first rays of sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating the wreckage of their brief, fragile happiness. Jacob moved first. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her while she shook with silent sobs. It's all right, he murmured into her hair. We'll be all right. We'll figure this out. But Eleanor wasn't sure anything would ever be all right again. She thought of Abigail upstairs, crying alone in her room. Thought of Daniel, who'd lost one wife to death and now felt betrayed by the woman who was supposed to replace her. Thought of Virginia Cole, who would step into Eleanor's place and erase any trace that Eleanor had ever been here. She'd come to Colorado Territory seeking safety and found something infinitely more complicated. She'd found love, yes, but she'd also found connection, purpose, a child who needed her. And now she was losing it all because she'd been foolish enough to let her guard down, to let herself hope. The day passed in a blur of miserable preparation. Jacob went to his cabin to pack his few belongings, while Eleanor moved through the house gathering her own things. It didn't take long. She owned so little. Her clothes, a few books, the stories she'd written for Abigail, the violin Jacob had given her, which now felt heavy with bittersweet memory. Abigail stayed locked in her room, refusing to come out even for meals. Eleanor stood outside the child's door several times, her hand raised to knock. But what could she say? What comfort could she offer when she was the one leaving? Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened, Eleanor wrote a note on a piece of precious paper. She slipped it under Abigail's door and heard the child's soft gasp as she picked it up. The note said, "I love you. I will always love you. You are brave and smart and kind, and you will grow up to be a remarkable woman. Never forget how special you are. Your friend forever, Eleanor." She heard crying from behind the door, and it took everything Eleanor had not to break down herself. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, wishing she could reach through and hold the child one more time, then forced herself to walk away. That evening, as she was wrapping the violin carefully in cloth, Daniel appeared in her doorway. He looked exhausted, older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been that morning. "Mrs. Cole came by," he said without preamble. "She heard about everything. News travels fast in small towns." Eleanor waited, not sure what he wanted from her. "She said I was being too harsh, that I should at least let you stay until we can make proper arrangements for your travel to Denver." He paused, his expression conflicted. "But I can't have you here, Eleanor. Every time I look at you, I see my own failure. My late wife's been gone 2 years, and I thought I was ready to move forward, but clearly I'm not. I brought you into this mess without thinking about what it would mean for any of us." Eleanor shook her head. She wanted to tell him this wasn't his fault, that she'd made her own choices, that life was just complicated and messy, and sometimes there were no good solutions. "Jacob can stay through the winter if he keeps to himself and does his work," Daniel continued. "I can't afford to be short a hand with calving season coming, but you—" He sighed. "Virginia's arranged for you to stay with the minister's wife in town until the spring stage runs. She's even written to a music school in Denver, inquired about teaching positions. She's being remarkably generous, considering that Eleanor had been an obstacle to Virginia's plans, considering that Eleanor's departure cleared the way for Virginia to become Mrs. Daniel Hale without complication. "You'll leave tomorrow," Daniel said. "I'll drive you into town myself." Eleanor nodded numbly. Tomorrow. So soon. She looked around the small bedroom that had been hers for such a short time and felt the walls closing in. "For what it's worth," Daniel said quietly, "I don't think you meant any harm. And Abigail, she does love you. She'll get over it, children do, but right now she loves you." He cleared his throat. That counts for something. Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with her half-packed carpet bag and the crushing weight of all her might-have-beens. She found Jacob in the barn after dark, brushing down the horses with methodical precision. He looked up when she entered, his face drawn and weary. "Heard Daniel's letting me stay," he said, "but sending you to town." Eleanor nodded. She crossed the barn and took the brush from his hand, setting it aside, then wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest. Jacob held her tight, his chin resting on top of her head. "I'll come for you," he said fiercely. "Soon as calving season's done. Soon as I can save a bit more money. I'll come to Denver, and we'll leave together. Go somewhere fresh, somewhere nobody knows us or cares about our past. I promise you, Eleanor, this isn't the end." Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt. But she'd learned that promises were fragile things, easily broken by circumstance and time and the sheer grinding weight of reality. Still, she nodded against his chest and let herself pretend for just a little longer that love might actually be enough. They stood together in the quiet barn, surrounded by the warm smell of horses and hay, while snow began to fall outside. Soft, silent flakes that would bury everything by morning, covering tracks and smoothing away evidence that anything had ever disturbed the pristine surface. Eleanor thought about the mail-order bride advertisement she'd answered back in Chicago, the desperate leap of faith that had brought her here. She'd been running from one kind of pain and had stumbled straight into another. But she'd also found something she hadn't expected, people who'd seen her, really seen her, despite her silence. A child who'd loved her without reservation. A man who'd looked past her brokenness and found something worth cherishing. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the world transformed into a crystalline wonderland by the night's snowfall. Eleanor dressed in her best dress, the one she'd worn when she arrived, which seemed like a lifetime ago, and braided her hair with trembling fingers. She packed the last of her belongings, including the violin carefully wrapped in its cloth, and carried everything downstairs. Abigail was waiting in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw Eleanor, she ran forward and threw her arms around her waist one more time. "Please don't forget me," the child whispered. Eleanor knelt down, pulled Abigail close, and kissed her forehead. Then she did something she hadn't done since that terrible night in Chicago. She tried to speak. She formed the words carefully with her lips, pushing air past her vocal cords, willing sound to emerge. "Never," she managed to whisper, the word barely audible, rough and cracked from months of disuse, but real. "Never forget you." Abigail's eyes went wide. "You talked. Mrs. Eleanor, you talked." Eleanor smiled through her tears and nodded. It wasn't much, just 2 hoarse, broken words, but they were something. A beginning, maybe. A tiny crack in the wall that had imprisoned her voice. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "The wagon's ready." Eleanor stood, smoothing down her skirts. Jacob was already outside, loading her trunk onto the wagon, his movements stiff with suppressed emotion. She took one last look around the kitchen where she'd worked so many hours, the main room where she'd played violin by firelight, the stairs leading up to the bedrooms where she'd tucked Abigail in and told her silent stories. This had almost been home. Almost. She followed Daniel out into the brilliant morning. Jacob helped her into the wagon without speaking, but his hand lingered on hers for a moment, warm and steady. She looked into his storm-colored eyes and saw a promise there. This isn't goodbye. Just goodbye for now. Then Daniel was climbing into the driver's seat and the horses were moving, pulling the wagon away from the ranch house. Eleanor twisted in her seat to watch it recede. The house, the barn, the corrals, and Jacob standing in the yard with his hands in his pockets, growing smaller and smaller until the road curved and trees blocked her view. Gone. The ride into Millstone was silent. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, and Eleanor stared at her hands folded in her lap. The town appeared through the trees, still small, still rough, but somehow familiar now. This was where her new life in Colorado had begun, and now it was where that life ended. Daniel pulled up in front of a neat white house with a sign that read Reverend and Mrs. James Fletcher. Before Eleanor could move, the front door opened and a plump, kind-faced woman in her 50s emerged, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You must be Mrs. Price," she said warmly. "I'm Martha Fletcher. Virginia Cole wrote to me about your situation. Come in, come in. You must be frozen." Daniel helped Eleanor down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the porch. He set it down, then stood there awkwardly, as if searching for something to say. "The stage runs to Denver first week of March," he finally said. "That's about 6 weeks. I'll send your wages with the driver. Fair payment for the work you did." He paused. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." Eleanor nodded. She wanted to say something. "Thank you, I'm sorry, I hope you find happiness with Virginia," but her brief moment of speech had passed and her voice had locked away again. So she simply nodded and watched Daniel climb back onto the wagon and drive away without looking back. "Come along, dear," Martha Fletcher said gently, guiding Eleanor inside. "Let's get you settled. You've had quite an ordeal, I imagine." The Fletcher house was warm and cluttered in a comfortable way. Books stacked on every surface, needlework projects in various states of completion, the smell of baking bread filling the air. Martha led Eleanor to a small guest room on the 2nd floor, chattering pleasantly about the weather and the town, and how nice it would be to have company. "I know about your condition," Martha said carefully as Eleanor set down her carpet bag. "Virginia explained that you don't speak, but I want you to know that's perfectly fine with me. My grandmother lost her voice after a stroke, lived another 10 years communicating just fine with gestures and written notes. We'll manage beautifully, I'm sure." Eleanor felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Martha Fletcher seemed genuinely kind, not pitying or judgmental, just accepting. "Now," Martha continued, "Virginia also mentioned you're a gifted musician. She thinks you could make an excellent living teaching in Denver. The Westfield Academy is looking for a music instructor, and I've taken the liberty of writing to them on your behalf." Virginia provided a glowing reference, and I added my own recommendation. which I hope you don't mind, though we've only just met. I'm an excellent judge of character." Eleanor managed a small smile. Virginia Cole was nothing if not efficient. Within 24 hours of Eleanor's dismissal from the ranch, she'd arranged housing, employment prospects, and character references. It was impressive, really, and impossibly sad. The weeks that followed developed their own quiet rhythm. Eleanor helped Martha with household tasks, played the church organ on Sundays, and slowly, carefully, began to practice speaking again. At first it was just single words: yes, no, thank you, forced past the barriers of fear and pain. Her voice was rough, unreliable, often failing halfway through a sentence, but it was there, waiting, healing. Martha was patient and encouraging, never pushing but always ready to listen when Eleanor managed to get words out. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and Eleanor would play the violin while Martha did her needlework. And something about the peaceful domesticity of it soothed the raw places in Eleanor's heart. But she missed the ranch, missed Abigail's chatter and laughter, missed the vast open spaces and the mountains turning pink at sunset. And she missed Jacob with an ache that sometimes felt physical, like something vital had been torn from her chest. He came to town twice during those 6 weeks, both times on ranch business, and both times he found a way to see her. They'd walk through the snowy streets, Eleanor bundled in her inadequate coat, and Jacob matching his long stride to her shorter one, and they'd talk. Or rather, he'd talk and she'd listen and occasionally contribute a hoarse word or two. "Daniel's courting Virginia properly now," Jacob told her during the first visit. "She comes to the ranch twice a week. She's struggling with it, keeps asking about you. I told her you were well, that you were living in town and getting ready for your new teaching position." Eleanor's heart clenched. She whispered, "Is she angry?" "At Daniel, mostly. She barely speaks to him." Jacob kicked at a chunk of ice on the boardwalk. "She told me she's going to run away and come live with us when we get our own place." Eleanor's eyes widened. "She knows? About us?" "I think so. 7-year-olds are sharper than people give them credit for." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. Come spring, we leave, together." During the second visit, Jacob brought news that made Eleanor's stomach drop. "Daniel and Virginia are getting married, end of February. She's already moved most of her things into the house." So soon. Not even 3 months since Eleanor had arrived, and already she'd been replaced, erased, written out of the story like she'd never existed. "There's going to be a town social to celebrate," Jacob continued. "Dancing, music, the whole affair. Virginia requested specifically that you be invited. She asked if you'd play the violin for the first dance." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Virginia wanted her to perform at her wedding celebration? To stand there and play music while Daniel married another woman? "I told her that was cruel," Jacob said quickly, "but she insisted it wasn't. Said it would be good for you, help the town see your talent, maybe drum up students for when you go to Denver." He took Eleanor's hands. "You don't have to go. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." But Eleanor found herself nodding slowly. Part of her, the hurt, angry part, wanted to refuse, to stay away and nurse her wounds in private. But another part, stronger and more stubborn, wanted to prove something, to show Daniel, Virginia, and the whole town of Millstone that she was more than her silence, more than her brokenness, that she had value and strength and deserved to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, music could say what her voice still struggled to express. The night of the social arrived cold and clear, the stars sharp overhead. Martha helped Eleanor dress in her best clothes. The green dress she'd been saving, mended and pressed until it looked almost new. She braided Eleanor's dark hair into an elaborate crown and loaned her a cameo brooch that had belonged to her own mother. "You look lovely, dear," Martha said warmly. "Now remember, head high, shoulders back, you have nothing to be ashamed of." Eleanor nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. She picked up the violin case, took a deep breath, and followed Martha out into the cold night. The town hall was ablaze with lamplight and crowded with people. It seemed like everyone in Millstone and the surrounding ranches had come to celebrate Daniel Hale's upcoming marriage to Virginia Cole. Eleanor paused in the doorway, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd, fighting the urge to turn and flee. Then she saw Jacob leaning against the far wall, his eyes searching the room. When he spotted her, his face lit up and he started toward her, cutting through the crowd with easy confidence. "You came," he said, reaching her side. "I wasn't sure you would." Eleanor managed a small smile. She whispered, "Couldn't let her win." Jacob grinned. "That's my girl." Virginia appeared moments later, gliding through the crowd in a dress of deep burgundy silk that must have cost more than Eleanor had earned in a year. Her dark hair was arranged in perfect ringlets, and diamonds sparkled at her throat, her late husband's parting gift, no doubt. She looked every inch the sophisticated Eastern lady, and beside her, Eleanor felt small and plain and desperately out of place. But Virginia's smile was warm and seemingly genuine as she approached. "Mrs. Price, I'm so glad you came. And you brought your violin. Wonderful." She gestured toward a small raised platform at the front of the hall where someone had set up chairs for musicians. "Whenever you're ready, dear. There's no rush." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She let Jacob guide her toward the platform, aware of eyes following her, of whispers rippling through the crowd. The silent woman, the one who'd been dismissed from the Hale Ranch, the one who'd been replaced. She set down her violin case and began unpacking the instrument with trembling fingers. The familiar weight of it in her hands steadied her somewhat. This she could do. This she knew. Daniel appeared at the edge of the platform, Abigail's hand clasped firmly in his. The child looked miserable in her fancy new dress, her hair elaborately curled in a style that didn't suit her. When she saw Eleanor, her face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "Mrs. Eleanor?" She tried to pull away from her father, but Daniel held tight. "Abigail, remember what we discussed," he said quietly. "Mrs. Price is here as a musician. You can say hello, but then you need to let her prepare." Abigail's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. "Hello, Mrs. Eleanor. I missed you. I missed you so much." Eleanor's heart cracked. She whispered, "Missed you, too, sweetheart." Abigail's eyes went wide. "You're talking! Papa, she's talking!" Daniel's expression flickered with something complicated. Surprise, perhaps, or regret. That's good, Abigail. I'm glad." He looked at Eleanor, and for a moment something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what might have been, of roads not taken, of the strange and winding path that had brought them all to this moment. "Thank you for doing this, Mrs. Price. It's generous of you." Eleanor managed a nod. She wanted to tell him she hoped he'd be happy, that Virginia seemed like a good match for him, that Abigail would adjust in time, but the words tangled in her throat, and all she could do was watch as he led his daughter away to join Virginia on the other side of the room. Jacob touched her arm gently. "You don't have to do this," he said again. "We can leave right now, go back to Martha's, pack our things, and be gone before anyone notices." Eleanor shook her head. She'd come this far. She'd stand on this platform and play her heart out and show this town. Show Daniel and Virginia and everyone who'd ever dismissed her as broken or less than that silence didn't mean she had nothing to say. The Reverend called for attention, welcoming everyone to the celebration and saying a few words about Daniel and Virginia's upcoming union. Eleanor only half listened, her focus on the violin in her hands, on steadying her breathing, on finding the calm center she needed to perform. Then Virginia was speaking, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Before we begin the dancing, I'd like everyone to hear something truly special. Mrs. Eleanor Price has graciously agreed to play for us tonight. Many of you may not know that Mrs. Price is an extraordinarily talented musician. I believe her gift deserves to be recognized and celebrated. Mrs. Price?" All eyes turned to Eleanor. The weight of their attention pressed down on her. Curiosity, pity, judgment, interest, all of it mixed together in a suffocating wave. For a moment, her hands froze on the violin. She couldn't do this. Couldn't stand here exposed and vulnerable while everyone watched and waited for her to either succeed or fail. Then Jacob caught her eye from where he stood at the back of the room. He nodded once. "You can do this," that nod said. "I believe in you." And Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. She raised the violin to her shoulder, positioned the bow, closed her eyes, and began to play. The piece she'd chosen was one she'd learned as a girl, a waltz by Strauss, bright and lilting and full of joy. Her fingers found the notes with growing confidence, muscle memory taking over where fear tried to paralyze her. The music poured out of her, filling the hall with sound and light and beauty. And for those few minutes, Eleanor forgot about everything except the conversation between bow and strings, the way the melody rose and fell like breathing. She could feel the audience listening, could sense the shift in the room from polite attention to genuine engagement. This was what her voice had always been meant for, not small talk or social pleasantries or the thousand mundane exchanges that made up daily life, but this, pure expression, raw emotion given shape and sound. When the final note faded, there was a moment of profound silence. Then applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic, and Eleanor opened her eyes to find people smiling at her with something that looked like respect. Virginia led the applause, her expression gracious. Daniel looked stunned, as if seeing Eleanor clearly for the first time, and Abigail was bouncing on her toes, her face radiant with pride. "Beautiful," and someone called out, "Play another." Eleanor's lips curved in a small smile. She nodded and launched into a reel, something faster, more playful. And soon people were moving onto the dance floor, couples pairing up and spinning to the lively rhythm. Jacob appeared beside the platform and extended his hand to a young woman Eleanor recognized from the general store, leading her into the dance with easy grace. He was being careful, Eleanor realized, not to give the gossips any more ammunition by claiming her too publicly. She played through 3 more dances, her confidence growing with each piece. Between songs, people approached to thank her, to compliment her playing, to ask if she'd consider teaching their daughters. Martha Fletcher beamed from her seat near the refreshment table, nodding encouragingly. During a break, while someone else took over the music, a fiddler who played with more enthusiasm than skill, Eleanor slipped outside for air. The cold hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it after the close heat of the crowded hall. She stood on the porch, breathing clouds into the night, and tried to process the evening's strange success. The door opened behind her, and she turned expecting Jacob, but it was Daniel. "That was remarkable," he said quietly, staying a respectful distance away. "I knew you could play, but I didn't understand how gifted you really are." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and waited for him to continue. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Several apologies, actually. I brought you here under false pretenses. I told myself I was looking for a wife, but what I really wanted was someone to fill the empty spaces Sarah left behind without requiring anything from me. That wasn't fair to you." Eleanor shook her head. She whispered, "I came with false pretenses, too. Never meant to be real wife." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Because of whatever happened to you? Whatever stole your voice?" Eleanor nodded. "May I ask what it was?" She hesitated, then forced the words out, each one an effort but coming easier than before. "My fiancé betrayed me with my sister. Found them together. Tried to scream, but nothing came out. Voice just stopped." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, that's a terrible thing to survive." He cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, I think Jacob's a good man. Better than me in many ways. He sees people, really sees them. I just see what I need them to be." "You're not a bad man," Eleanor managed. "Just hurt. Maybe." Daniel looked back toward the door where light and music spilled out. "Virginia's not Sarah, I know that. But she makes me feel less alone, and right now that's what I need. Abigail will adjust. And you're going to Denver, going to teach at that academy, going to build a real life for yourself." Eleanor wanted to tell him that she wasn't going to Denver, that she and Jacob were planning to leave together, to start fresh somewhere new. But that wasn't Daniel's business anymore, and something told her he didn't really want to know. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Daniel said. "Happiness, peace, your voice, fully." He held out his hand. "No hard feelings?" Eleanor took his hand and shook it. "No hard feelings?" Daniel nodded, squeezed her hand once, and went back inside. Eleanor stood alone on the porch for another moment, watching her breath make clouds in the moonlight, and felt something heavy lift from her shoulders. Closure, maybe. Or just the knowledge that she'd handled an impossible situation with as much grace as she could muster. The door opened again. This time it was Jacob, and the sight of him made her heart leap. "There you are," he said, crossing to her side. "People are asking for you. They want more music." Eleanor smiled. "Let them wait. Need moment." Jacob pulled off his coat and draped it around her shoulders, then stood beside her in comfortable silence. After a moment, he said, "You were magnificent in there. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." Eleanor leaned against him, soaking in his warmth. She whispered, "Scared." "I know, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is." They stood together watching the stars, and Eleanor thought about all the impossible things that had happened since that day she'd stepped off the stage in Millstone. She'd lost her position at the ranch, but she'd found her voice, or at least the beginning of it. She'd lost Daniel's protection, but she'd found Jacob's love. She'd lost the security of a predetermined future, but she'd gained the terrifying freedom to choose her own path. "Jacob," she said, the name coming easier than most words, "when do we leave?" "Stage to Denver runs day after tomorrow," Jacob said. "But we're not taking that stage. I talked to a freight hauler heading to California. He's leaving end of the week, said he'd give us passage if I help with the driving. We'd go through Nevada, end up in Sacramento. I hear there's good ranch land in the valleys north of there, and plenty of work for anyone willing to put in the effort." California. Eleanor had never imagined going so far, starting so completely over. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "You sure?" she whispered. "About me? About this?" Jacob turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You're the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice trusting me." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She pulled one hand free and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, memorizing him. Then she rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Jacob was smiling. "Is that a yes?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to everything." They went back inside and Eleanor played for another hour, her fingers flying over the strings, her heart soaring with each note. She played waltzes and reels and ballads, and the people of Millstone danced and laughed and celebrated, and for that brief window of time, Eleanor felt like she belonged somewhere, was part of something. During the last dance of the evening, a slow, romantic piece she played from memory, she watched Daniel lead Virginia onto the floor. They moved together with surprising grace, and Virginia's face was turned up to Daniel's with genuine affection. Maybe they would be happy. Maybe Virginia's light and confidence would fill the spaces Sarah had left, and Daniel would learn to move forward instead of backward. And Abigail, standing at the edge of the dance floor with Martha Fletcher, caught Eleanor's eye and waved shyly. Eleanor smiled and nodded back, and the child's face brightened. They'd said their real goodbye weeks ago, but this felt like closure, a gentle acknowledgement that they'd both survived this parting, that the love between them was real even if the circumstances were impossible. When the evening finally ended and people began filing out into the cold night, several women approached Eleanor with requests for music lessons. She politely declined, explaining through halting words and gestures that she'd be leaving Millstone soon. They looked disappointed but wished her well, and Eleanor felt a strange, bittersweet gratitude for their kindness. Martha linked arms with Eleanor as they walked back to the parsonage through the snow. "You were wonderful tonight, dear. Absolutely wonderful. Are you sure about leaving? I think you could build quite a nice life here, teaching and performing. The town has clearly taken to you." Eleanor squeezed Martha's arm affectionately. "Thank you for everything, but need to go forward, not stay still." "With Mr. Ward?" Eleanor's step faltered. She looked at Martha in surprise. The older woman smiled gently. "I'm not blind, dear, and I'm not a gossip either. I've seen the way you two look at each other when you think no one's watching. He's a good man, from what I can tell, and you deserve happiness. Is it wrong? Eleanor whispered. Daniel brought me here to be his. Daniel let you go, Martha interrupted firmly. Whatever arrangement you had, it's ended. You're a free woman, Eleanor, free to choose your own path, your own happiness. Don't let guilt keep you from living. They reached the parsonage, and Martha pulled Eleanor into a warm embrace. You write to me when you get settled, wherever you end up. I want to know how the story ends. Eleanor hugged her back, grateful beyond words for this woman's kindness. She whispered, I will, promise. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the handful of people in Millstone who'd shown her kindness, and tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. She was leaving everything familiar, again, to chase an uncertain future with a man she'd known for barely 4 months. It was reckless and impractical and possibly insane, but it also felt right in a way nothing else had in years. Jacob came for her before dawn on the day of their departure. The freight wagon was loaded and ready, the driver, a taciturn man named Rawlings, already in his seat. Jacob helped Eleanor climb up onto the bench beside Rawlings, then swung himself up on the other side. All set? Rawlings asked, not waiting for an answer before snapping the reins. The horses lurched forward, and the wagon began to roll. Eleanor looked back at Millstone one last time, the small collection of buildings barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, the mountains rising behind them like silent guardians. Somewhere in those mountains was the Hale Ranch, and Abigail sleeping in her warm bed, and the life Eleanor had almost lived. Then Jacob's hand found hers, warm and steady, and Eleanor turned to face forward, toward the unknown, toward California, toward whatever came next. The journey west was long and hard. They traveled through snow and mud, across endless plains and over mountain passes that made Eleanor's breath catch with their terrible beauty. Rawlings proved to be a decent traveling companion, quiet but fair, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally broke through his gruff exterior. He asked no questions about Eleanor's silence or her relationship with Jacob, simply accepted their presence and expected them to pull their weight. Jacob drove the wagon when Rawlings needed rest, and Eleanor helped with camp chores, cooking over open fires and mending harnesses and doing whatever needed doing. At night, they'd curl up together under blankets in the back of the wagon, and Jacob would hold her while she shook from cold or fear or sheer exhaustion. He never complained, never suggested they'd made a mistake, never looked at her with anything but love and determination. And slowly, gradually, Eleanor's voice continued to return. The words came easier with each passing day, her vocal cords strengthening with use. She'd never be a great conversationalist, the trauma had marked her too deeply for that, but she could speak when it mattered, could say the things that needed saying. I love you, she told Jacob one night while they lay under the stars somewhere in Nevada, the desert spreading out around them like an ocean of sand and sage. The words came out clear and sure, no hesitation. I love you so much. Jacob pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. They reached Sacramento in early April, just as the valley was exploding into spring. The town was rough and growing, full of miners heading to the goldfields and farmers claiming land and everyone chasing some version of the American dream. It was loud and chaotic and nothing like the quiet ranches of Colorado, but Eleanor found she didn't mind. There was something liberating about being in a place where everyone was starting over, where no one knew her story or cared about her past. Jacob found work quickly on a ranch north of the city, a large operation that needed experienced hands and paid decent wages. The owner's wife, hearing that Eleanor was a musician, immediately requested that she teach their 3 daughters. Other families followed, and within a month, Eleanor had more students than she could handle. They rented a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Jacob built them a table and chairs from scrap wood, and Eleanor sewed curtains from cheap fabric, and together they created something that felt like home. On a warm May evening, they stood together on the porch of their little house and watched the sun set over the mountains. Jacob's arm was around Eleanor's waist, and her head rested on his shoulder, and everything felt right in a way it never had before. Marry me, Jacob said suddenly. Properly, with a minister and witnesses and rings. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, her heart racing. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Jacob took her hands. I know we're already living as husband and wife. I know we've already committed to each other in every way that matters. But I want to stand up in front of God and everyone and claim you as mine. I want you to have my name. I want the world to know that you're the most important person in my life. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Then, stronger. Yes, yes. Jacob Ward, I will marry you. They were wed a week later in a small church with whitewashed walls and wildflowers in mason jars. Rawlings stood as Jacob's witness, and the wife of the ranch owner stood as Eleanor's. The ceremony was simple. No fancy dress, no elaborate celebration, just two people promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," Jacob cupped Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. And when they pulled apart, Eleanor found herself smiling, really, truly smiling, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The reception was held at their little house, with neighbors bringing food and music and laughter. Someone produced a fiddle and called for dancing, and Jacob spun Eleanor around their tiny front room while everyone clapped and cheered. She was breathless and dizzy and completely, impossibly happy. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone home, Eleanor picked up her violin and began to play. She played Beautiful Dreamer, the song she'd played that night at the Hale Ranch, the night she'd first realized her music could speak when her voice couldn't. But this time the melody felt different, less melancholy, more hopeful, a promise instead of a lament. Jacob watched her from across the room, his eyes bright with love and pride, and Eleanor played for him, for this good, kind man who'd seen past her brokenness to the whole person underneath, who'd taught her that silence could be strength, that love could heal, that new beginnings were always possible if you were brave enough to reach for them. When the final note faded, Jacob crossed the room and pulled her close. "That was beautiful," he whispered. "You're beautiful." Eleanor set down the violin and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she said clearly, the words flowing easily now, "for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me a reason to speak again." "You always had a voice," Jacob said. "You just needed to find a safe place to use it." And standing there in their small house, with the California stars shining through the window, Eleanor realized he was right. She'd lost her voice in Chicago, trapped it away behind walls of fear and pain and betrayal. But she'd found it again here, in this unexpected place, with this unexpected man. Not all at once. Healing never worked that way. But gradually, carefully, one hard-won word at a time. Summer came, hot and golden, and Eleanor's teaching practice thrived. She took on students not just in music but in reading and writing, her small house becoming a kind of informal school. Jacob was promoted to foreman at the ranch, a testament to his skill and work ethic. They saved money, made plans, dreamed of buying their own land someday. And on a warm August evening, a letter arrived from Colorado. Eleanor recognized Abigail's careful handwriting on the envelope, and her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short, but full of news. Daniel and Virginia had married in March. Abigail liked Virginia better than she'd expected. The woman was strict but fair, and she'd convinced Daniel to let Abigail stay home instead of going to boarding school. They were expecting a baby in the fall. The ranch was doing well. The mountains were beautiful in summer. And at the end, in larger letters that suggested Abigail had pressed hard with her pencil. "I miss you every day, Mrs. Eleanor, but I'm glad you're happy. Jacob is lucky to have you. Please write back and tell me about California. Love, Abigail." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. But they were good tears, healing tears. She sat down immediately and wrote back, telling Abigail about Sacramento and the ranch and her students and the small house she shared with Jacob. She told her about getting married, about playing music for people who appreciated it, about learning to speak again slowly and imperfectly, but truly. And she told Abigail something she'd only just realized herself, that sometimes the wrong path leads you exactly where you need to be. that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what matters most, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She ended the letter with a promise. You will always have a place in my heart, sweet girl. And if you ever need me, I'll be here. Your friend forever, Eleanor Ward. Eleanor Ward. The name still felt new, unfamiliar, like a coat she was trying on for the first time. But it fit. It felt right. Jacob came home just as she was sealing the letter, dusty and tired from a long day, but smiling when he saw her. Good day? He asked, kissing her cheek. Very good, Eleanor said, the words coming easily now, barely a rasp. Letter from Abigail. Everyone's well. I'm glad. Jacob washed up at the basin, then came to sit beside her at their handmade table. I've been thinking. About? That piece of land the owner mentioned, the 40 acres up near the creek. He's willing to sell it reasonable, said we could make payments over 5 years. Jacob took her hand. We could build our own place, Eleanor. Have enough land for some horses, maybe a few cattle. You could teach from home. We could... He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. We could build something real, something that lasts. Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd given her everything, who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, who'd shown her that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other every single day despite the imperfections. And she knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever challenges or joys or sorrows the future held, they'd face it together. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Let's build something real. Jacob's face broke into a grin, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Through the open window, Eleanor could hear neighbors calling to each other, children laughing, the distant sound of someone playing a guitar. Life happening all around them, messy and complicated and beautiful. She'd come west as a woman who'd forgotten how to speak, running from pain and betrayal and the ashes of a life that had burned down around her. She'd expected silence and solitude and a kind of safe, numb existence where she couldn't be heard again. But instead she'd found music. She'd found purpose. She'd found a child who'd loved her unreservedly and a man who'd taught her that her voice, whether spoken or played or simply expressed through the way she lived her life, mattered. That she mattered. And standing there in Jacob's arms, in their small house in California, with the whole vast future stretching out before them, Eleanor finally understood what her mother had tried to tell her all those years ago. That music was the voice of the soul, and even when words failed, even when fear tried to silence you, your soul could still sing. She pulled back from Jacob's embrace, picked up her violin, and began to play. The melody that emerged was something new, something she'd been composing in her head for weeks, but hadn't dared to play aloud. It was hopeful and bright and shot through with joy, a song about new beginnings and second chances and the possibility of healing. Jacob listened, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he said, "That was incredible. What's it called?" Eleanor smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "The cowboy who taught me to speak again." And there, in the golden California evening, with love and hope and an infinite horizon ahead of them, Eleanor Ward, the woman who'd lost her voice and found it again, finally came home. The two https os www.youtube.com watch v z2s5p8l1i. Here's a cinematic, dramatic 5-part summary in American storytelling style, rewritten with new character names, no repeats from any CB story, following the full arc: opening, rising action, climax, resolution, breakthrough, and ending, and closing the story completely. Title: The Silent Bride and the Cowboy Who Taught Her to Speak Again. 1. Opening: The Woman Who Forgot How to Speak. Colorado Territory, 1883. The stagecoach jolted to a stop, and Eleanor Price stepped down clutching a worn carpet bag and a letter signed by a rancher named Daniel Hale, a widower seeking companionship and help with his little girl. Eleanor hadn't spoken since a betrayal in Chicago shattered her voice and her trust. The town of Millstone was quiet. its frozen wind slicing through her shawl. Daniel hadn't come to meet her. Instead, a gentle cowboy named Jacob Ward greeted her, saying Daniel was tending to sick cattle. Jacob's calm, kind voice filled the silence she carried. She nodded once, the only answer she could manage, and followed him toward the ranch, and into a future she could neither imagine nor yet believe she deserved. 2. Rising Action, the house without a mother. The Hale Ranch was clean but cold, every surface neat, every corner missing warmth. Daniel welcomed her with politeness but little feeling. His daughter Abigail ran to Eleanor with eager eyes and asked, "Are you my new mama?" The words pierced through Eleanor's quiet heart. She tried to respond, but her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she knelt, smiled, and braided the child's hair. Each day she worked harder, cooking, mending, and earning trust through small acts instead of speech. But it was Jacob who noticed the pain in her eyes, who treated her silence as strength instead of shame. When he invited her to ride to the ridge, to see the valley spread gold beneath the mountains, she found, for the first time in months, that silence could feel like peace instead of punishment. 3. Climax, the blizzard and the barn. When winter struck, a fierce blizzard howled through Millstone. Daniel rode off to help a neighbor save trapped cattle, leaving Eleanor, Abigail, and Jacob to weather the storm alone. The wind screamed against the house, snow piling high against the windows. Jacob worked to keep the fire burning, his presence steady, protective. But when the barn roof began to buckle under the weight of snow, he tied himself to the porch and went out. Eleanor gripped the rope with frozen hands, praying soundlessly until he returned, soaked, shivering, but alive. When he stepped through the door, she ran to him, clutching his coat with trembling fingers. "I'm all right," he whispered. She looked up at him, heart pounding, and for the first time in months, she felt warmth strong enough to melt fear itself. 4. Resolution, the music of her heart. Days later, the storm broke. Daniel returned, with a sophisticated widow named Virginia Cole beside him. Her polished laughter filled the house, and Eleanor felt herself fade again, unseen, unheard. But Jacob brought her a gift, his grandfather's old violin. "For you," he said softly. Music's another way to speak. That evening, she played Beautiful Dreamer. The melody rose through the house, gentle, trembling, alive. When the final note faded, tears streaked Abigail's cheeks. "It sounds like Mama," the girl whispered. Daniel stood motionless, stunned. Even Virginia had no words. Eleanor's music said everything her voice could not, that pain could become beauty, and silence could become strength. 5. Breakthrough and ending. The voice returns. At the town social, Eleanor was asked to play again. Before a crowd of neighbors, she poured her heart into the violin until the hall went still. When the last chord lingered in the air, she finally spoke, soft but sure. "Thank you." Her first word in months. Later that night, outside beneath the lanterns, Jacob took her hands. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I love you." She looked up through tears. "I love you too." The words were barely a whisper, yet they carried through the mountain wind like a hymn. Spring came. Daniel found new love with Virginia, and Abigail gained not one mother but 2 hearts who cared for her. As for Eleanor and Jacob, they built their own cabin by the ridge, where laughter and music replaced silence forever.